At exactly 6 in the morning, while most of the neighborhood was still asleep, the valley learned how fragile peace really is. I was standing in my kitchen, watching steam rise from a chipped coffee mug, when my phone started buzzing nonstop. Missed calls, texts, one word kept repeating. Explosions. I dropped everything and drove uphill toward my property, heart racing faster with every turn of the road. What I found waiting for me would change my life and an entire community forever. Where my family's stone dam had stood for nearly a century, there was now a scar of broken limestone and drifting dust. Water spilled forward in confused streams, no longer guided, no longer restrained. The structure my great-grandfather built with his own hands was gone, reduced to rubble before breakfast, and standing there smiling like he'd just won a prize was HOA President Mark Reynolds, brushing dirt from his polo shirt while snapping photos on his phone. "Free demolition," he said casually, like he'd done me a favor. That swamp was hurting property values. What Mark didn't understand was that the swamp he destroyed wasn't decorative. It wasn't optional. That dam had controlled spring runoff since 1926. It protected every home, downhill from flooding during snowmelt season. Without it, the valley wasn't just vulnerable. It was exposed. 6 weeks from now, melting mountain snow would come rushing down with nowhere to slow it, and every house below would be in its path. As Mark posed for selfies laughing with a contractor, I realized something chilling. He thought this was over. He thought power meant permission. He believed paperwork could override physics. That confidence would become his downfall. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm a civil water systems engineer, recently divorced, recently returned to the land my family passed down through 4 generations. I came back looking for quiet, for purpose, for a place where I could rebuild my life. Instead, I walked into a small-town power struggle fueled by ego, greed, and a dangerous misunderstanding of how nature works. The development downhill was called Riverbend Heights. Rows of identical homes, perfect lawns, expensive promises. Mark wanted more expansion, more luxury appeal, and my land sat in the way of his vision. The dam wasn't ugly to him. It was inconvenient, and so he erased it. As the dust settled and the water kept moving, I understood one undeniable truth. This wasn't just about my family's legacy anymore. This was about what happens when arrogance collides with gravity, and gravity never negotiates. By noon, the destruction had already been reframed as a public service.
Have to make the move.
Official-looking trucks came and went, and neighbors gathered behind their fences, whispering about safety concerns and old structures. Mark Reynolds didn't waste a minute shaping the story. According to him, the dam had been a liability, a ticking time bomb, something the community had been lucky to remove before it hurt someone. What he didn't count on was the paperwork my family had kept for generations. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by yellowed folders, survey maps, and handwritten notes that smelled like dust and history. My great-grandfather had documented everything: water flow rates, stone placement, seasonal runoff patterns. This wasn't some backyard project. It was engineered flood control, built when men understood land because they worked it. I called Mark directly, trying one last time to resolve this like adults. He answered on the second ring, his voice smug and relaxed. "You don't own the water," he said. "It affects our community, which means we have jurisdiction." That's when it clicked. This wasn't ignorance. It was ambition. My land sat upstream from Riverbend Heights, and without the dam, the entire valley could be reclassified, rezoned, redeveloped. Mark didn't just want the structure gone. He wanted control of the water. Within days, the pressure started. Certified letters arrived claiming I owed back HOA fees for water management services I'd never agreed to. Fines stacked up on paper, designed to look overwhelming. Then came the inspectors. Fence violations, noise complaints. Even my mailbox was suddenly a problem. Each visit was polite, official, and clearly coordinated. I hired an attorney and learned something important. My property predated the HOA by decades. My family had explicitly refused membership when the development formed. The boundaries were legally muddy, and that made Mark nervous. So he did what insecure people do when they feel cornered. He cheated. A county inspector named Paul Simmons showed up claiming my dam was structurally unsound. He poked at the remaining stone with a screwdriver, took no measurements, and left after 20 minutes. The next morning, his report arrived. Immediate demolition required. Catastrophic failure risk. The report described concrete erosion typical of mid-century construction. The problem was simple. My dam wasn't concrete. It was hand-cut limestone from the 1920s. I commissioned an independent engineering assessment from a firm that specialized in historic infrastructure. They spent 6 hours inspecting every inch. Their conclusion was devastating to Mark's narrative. The dam exceeded modern safety standards by a wide margin. Estimated lifespan, 500 more years. Someone had falsified an official safety report to justify destroying flood control infrastructure. That's when I stopped playing defense. The moment Mark realized I wasn't bluffing, his strategy shifted from intimidation to theater. Headlines started appearing. In the local paper, warning of a dangerous aging dam threatening community safety. Anonymous neighbors were suddenly quoted, expressing fear about flooding that had never happened in their lifetimes. Mark went door to door with glossy flyers, showing catastrophic dam failures from completely different states, asking one question over and over. Would you want this behind your house? Fear spreads faster than facts, so I decided to remove fear from the equation. I invited every homeowner who signed Mark's petition to visit my property and see the site for themselves. 23 showed up on a Saturday morning, skeptical but curious. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I explained. I showed them how the spillway regulated water flow, how the stonework dispersed pressure, how removing the dam would send uncontrolled runoff straight into their streets during spring melt. By lunchtime, 18 of them withdrew their signatures. Mark did not take that well. 3 days later, county demolition trucks rolled onto my property at 6 in the morning. Workers began unloading equipment, while a crew chief waved the same falsified emergency report like a hall pass. I blocked the access, rode with my truck and started making phone calls, lawyers, reporters, county, supervisors. Within minutes, Mark arrived with sheriff's deputies, accusing me of interfering with public safety. Local news cameras showed up before anyone could stop them. Mark tried to explain why a structure that had stood safely for 99 years suddenly required immediate destruction on camera. While angry, it was painful to watch. He contradicted himself twice in under a minute. And the footage aired that night with the caption, HOA authority questioned. That should have been the end. Instead, Mark doubled down. A city councilman introduced an emergency ordinance targeting pre-1950 water retention structures. There was only one such structure in the entire county, mine. During the council meeting, I stood and asked a simple question. Can you name another structure this ordinance affects? Silence. That's when I presented development filings showing Mark owned nearly half the surrounding parcels through shell companies. His plan required removing my dam to build artificial water features for a resort-style expansion. The room shifted. Officials leaned back. Pens stopped moving. Environmental concern had been a lie. The vote was postponed, but Mark wasn't finished. He filed for eminent domain authority using forged seals and backdated reports, rushing the paperwork through a holiday weekend. I found out while grilling dinner, when my attorney called and said the words no property owner ever wants to hear. They're trying to seize your land tomorrow morning. That night I stopped thinking like a victim. I started thinking like an engineer. By sunrise the next morning, I was standing in front of my dam watching yellow, machines idle like predators waiting for permission to strike. The county had moved fast, too fast. Overnight notices had been taped to my gate, citing eminent domain authority that hadn't existed 48 hours earlier. The paperwork looked official, but something felt off. Dates didn't line up. Signatures were shaky, and the seal on the final page was a scanned copy I'd seen before in one of Mark's HOA emails. They were bluffing with ink and horsepower. I asked the foreman one question. Has anyone shown you a federal permit? He shrugged. He was just doing his job. That's how disasters usually start, with people following instructions without asking who wrote them. I told him to keep the engines off for 1 hour. If I was wrong, I'd move my truck and let them work. If I was right, he'd want plausible deniability. Then I made the most important call of my life. The Army Corps of Engineers had my great-grandfather's original dam plans on file. I knew that because I'd requested copies years earlier out of curiosity. What I hadn't known until that morning was that the structure had been quietly reclassified decades ago as part of a downstream flood control system protecting multiple communities, which meant one thing very clearly. Local authorities did not have the power to remove it. Federal law did. While the excavator operator sipped coffee and waited, a black SUV rolled up the dirt road. Then another. By the time the sheriff arrived, 3 federal vehicles were already parked by the spillway. Clipboards came out. Photos were taken. Voices stayed calm, but faces didn't. The county inspector who'd signed the emergency report refused to meet anyone's eyes. Within 30 minutes, the machines were ordered to shut down. Within 45, the site was declared a protected federal structure pending investigation. And within an hour, Mark's phone started ringing nonstop. I know because he called me twice, I didn't answer. That should have ended it. Instead, Mark made the worst decision of his life. He went public. At a hastily arranged press conference outside the HOA clubhouse, he accused me of endangering families, obstructing safety efforts, and manipulating federal agencies. Standing behind him were charts, predicting catastrophic floods if the dam remained in place. It might have worked if clouds hadn't started forming over the mountains behind him while he spoke. Colorado has a sense of humor like that. Meteorologists were already warning of an unusually heavy storm system moving in from the west. The same system engineers had cited in reports Mark had ignored. As rain began falling in the distance, I watched the press conference on my phone and felt something shift from anger to inevitability, because I knew what would happen if that dam failed, and more importantly, I knew what would happen if it was gone. By early afternoon, the rain arrived exactly when the models said it would. Not a drizzle, not a passing shower. A sustained, steady downpour that soaked the soil like a sponge pushed past capacity. From my porch, I watched water slide downhill in thin silver lines, all of it heading toward the same place. The valley floor. The homes. The space where the dam used to slow everything down. My phone lit up with alerts from 3 different weather services. Flash flood watch, then warning, then emergency. I forwarded every alert to the HOA board, the county office, and Mark himself. No response. Not even a read receipt. Either he was ignoring it, or someone had finally taken his phone away. At that point, it didn't matter. Water doesn't wait for meetings. Downstream, residents of Riverbend Heights started noticing puddles where none had ever formed before. Storm drains gurgled. Lawns turned into shallow lakes. Garage doors rattled as pressure built behind them. Parents carried kids upstairs while scrolling through news feeds that still hadn't caught up to reality. They'd been told the dam was dangerous. They'd been promised safety. Now they were standing ankle-deep in questions. By 3 o'clock, the first basement flooded. By 4, emergency calls overwhelmed dispatch. By 5, rescue boats were being loaded at the fire station. I drove down to the edge of the neighborhood and stopped when police blocked the road. From there, I could see brown water pushing through streets that had never planned for it. The slope funneled everything into one channel, exactly as the original engineers predicted a century ago. Without the dam's buffer, there was nothing to stop the surge. Local news finally arrived. Cameras pointed at the chaos, reporters shouting over rain and sirens. Someone recognized me and asked if this was related to the dam dispute. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The footage said everything. What stunned me most wasn't the flooding. It was the disbelief. People genuinely couldn't understand how something removed weeks earlier could be causing damage now. They'd been taught to see infrastructure as decoration instead of function. To believe authority mattered more than design. That misunderstanding was spreading faster than the water. As daylight faded behind thick clouds, evacuation orders went out. Families grabbed pets, documents, whatever they could carry. The same HOA newsletters that once complained about my unsightly pond were now useless against a force that didn't care about landscaping rules. Standing there in the rain, watching neighbors flee homes they thought were untouchable, I felt no satisfaction, only a heavy certainty. This was preventable, entirely, and someone had chosen profit over protection. By 6 o'clock, the community center lights came on. That building would become shelter, courtroom, and confession booth before the night was over. By the time I reached the community center, the parking lot looked like a disaster movie set filmed in broad daylight. Pickup trucks, sedans, and emergency vehicles were jammed together in no particular order. People moved fast but spoke quietly, like raising their voices might make everything worse. Inside, the gym echoed with footsteps, crying kids, and the constant buzz of uncertainty. 300 residents filled a space built for half that number. Mud streaked across the polished floor. Someone had taped handwritten signs pointing to restrooms, cots, and donated food. Local news crews lined the walls, cameras already rolling, sensing that this wasn't just a storm story. It was a human one. And it had villains. I didn't plan to speak. That decision was made for me when someone shouted my name. Heads turned. Whispers spread. Within seconds, I was standing at the podium with bright lights in my face and rescue boats visible through the windows behind me. I took a breath. 6 months ago, I said, "Your HOA president called my family's dam a safety hazard that needed immediate removal." Murmurs rippled through the room. Tonight, 47 homes are flooding because that dam is gone. Silence fell hard. Outside, rain intensified, drumming against the roof with cruel timing. I explained what the dam had done, how it slowed runoff, how engineers had warned this exact scenario would happen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Facts carry weight when people are standing in water. That's when Sheriff Maria Santos walked in. She moved with purpose, uniform soaked, holding a folder instead of a flashlight. Cameras swung toward her instantly. She stepped beside me and opened the folder slowly, like she wanted everyone to understand the moment. "Dexter Hawthorne," she announced. Scanning the room, "You are under arrest." A man in a baseball cap near the back froze. Then he tried to slip toward the exit. He didn't make it far. A woman blocked his path, arms crossed, eyes blazing with the fury of someone whose basement was currently underwater. Others closed in. No shouting. Just resolve. Handcuffs clicked. A reporter leaned in, microphone extended. "Do you have anything to say to the families affected by this flooding?" Dexter shook his head. "This isn't my fault. Nobody could have predicted this." I pulled out my phone and played the recording. His voice filled the gym, dismissing flood risks as exaggeration. Engineers labeled alarmists, concerns called fake. The crowd erupted. Sheriff Santos led him away as applause drowned out the rain. But the night wasn't finished. Not even close. Federal officials arrived next. Then state prosecutors. Charges stacked up faster than sandbags, fraud, embezzlement, environmental crimes, criminal negligence. As sirens echoed outside, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a decision. And decisions have consequences. While the arrest played out inside the community center, the flood didn't pause for applause. Water kept moving with quiet determination, pouring downhill exactly where engineers said it would. Streets designed for traffic became channels. Lawns turned into shallow lakes. Nature followed blueprints written long before zoning boards existed. Outside, rescue boats cut through neighborhoods that had never owned so much as a sandbag. Flashing lights reflected off windows as families climbed into boats carrying backpacks, pets, and the sudden understanding that water doesn't care about property values. Dexter's house was hit first. His $800,000 McMansion sat directly in the creek's original overflow path, a fact highlighted in every ignored engineering report. Water reached his driveway before most people finished dinner. By nightfall, it filled the ground floor with surgical precision, soaking imported hardwood floors and designer furniture that had never experienced inconvenience, let alone physics. I stood on higher ground watching water reclaim its memory. My phone vibrated nonstop as flood sensors triggered across the neighborhood. Each alert confirmed what science had promised and denial had ignored. 47 homes, same pattern, same elevation lines, same outcome. Local news helicopters circled overhead, capturing footage that would loop for weeks. Commentators used words like unexpected and historic, even though every detail had been documented in advance. The only surprise was how fast consequences arrived once the dam was gone. By midnight, the community center overflowed with evacuees. Volunteers handed out blankets and bottled water. Parents tried to reassure children while staring at phones, showing water, climbing staircases back home. Conversations kept circling back to the same question. Why didn't we listen? Federal investigators worked late into the night. Documents were seized, phones collected, emails preserved. Each agency uncovered pieces of the same story. Funds meant for maintenance diverted elsewhere, safety reports altered, warnings buried under signatures and rubber stamps. By morning, the narrative shifted. This wasn't about weather. It was about intent. State officials announced civil liability proceedings. Every flooded home, every ruined appliance, every damaged foundation. The costs would be calculated, assigned, and recovered. Insurance investigators confirmed the obvious. This wasn't an act of God, it was man-made. Dexter's allies began distancing themselves. Statements were revised. Memories shortened. Cooperation agreements appeared. The silence from those who once pushed hardest for demolition was louder than the sirens. As dawn broke, floodwaters slowly receded, leaving behind mud, debris, and clarity. People walked their streets in disbelief, tracing water lines up walls and realizing how close things had come to being worse. Much worse. Engineers surveyed damage with clipboards and quiet expressions. Morning light has a way of making denial impossible. When the sun rose over Millbrook Estates, it illuminated truth more clearly than any courtroom ever could. Mud lines etched across houses told the story in inches and feet. Soggy couches and warped cabinets lay on front lawns like evidence exhibits nobody could argue with. Neighbors walked slowly, staring at damage that didn't match the promises they'd been sold. Conversations were quiet now. No shouting, no accusations. Just the stunned realization that warnings had been real, and consequences didn't negotiate. Engineers moved through the neighborhood with calm efficiency, clipboards in hand, boots sinking into damp soil. They measured slopes, checked foundations, and documented flow paths. Every observation confirmed the same conclusion. The flooding followed historical patterns exactly. This was not chaos. It was predictability. Insurance adjusters arrived soon after, cameras clicking as they cataloged losses. Their language was precise and unforgiving. Man-made event. Negligence confirmed. Claims redirected. Responsibility assigned. For many homeowners, that was the moment fear shifted into anger. By noon, state officials held a press briefing. Cameras rolled as they explained that preliminary. Findings pointed to deliberate destruction of flood control infrastructure, not failure, not accident, intent. The word landed hard, echoing across a community that now understood what it meant. Inside the community center, exhausted families gathered around folding tables. Coffee cups steamed. Phones buzzed with updates. Relief workers passed out. Supplies while conversations turned from shock to accountability. People compared timelines, emails, meeting notes. Everything led back to the same small group of decisions that ignored expertise in favor of ego. Federal investigators returned with more questions, more documents, more evidence. Each interview peeled back another layer of how warnings had been dismissed, reports altered, and concerns mocked. The pattern was undeniable. This disaster had been engineered long before the water arrived. Local news anchors stopped calling it a storm event. The language shifted. Preventable flood. Avoidable damage. Officials under investigation. The narrative changed because facts demanded it. By afternoon, legal notices began circulating. Civil suits filed on behalf of homeowners. Emergency injunctions prepared. Assets identified. The process was slow, methodical, and relentless. Accountability doesn't rush. It accumulates. Standing near the exposed creek bed, I watched water carve paths through earth that had been restrained for generations. Without guidance, it spread wide and destructive. The same could be said of authority without knowledge. People stopped me as I walked. Some apologized. Others just nodded, unable to meet my eyes. There was no satisfaction in being right. Only relief that proof now existed where denial once lived. By the second day, the story had escaped the neighborhood. Statewide headlines replaced speculation with confirmation. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was the result of choices, documented and deliberate, made by people who believed authority could override reality. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. Subpoenas were issued. Financial records pulled. HOA accounts scrutinized line by line. Money meant for infrastructure had vanished into consulting fees, shell vendors, and personal favors. Paper trails don't lie, they wait. At a press conference held under clear blue skies, officials spoke carefully but firmly. Words like misconduct, breach of duty, and criminal negligence replaced softer language. Cameras captured every sentence, broadcasting accountability into living rooms across the state. Behind the microphones, engineers stood quietly. Their charts and models had finally become public exhibits. Flood maps, once dismissed as scare tactics, now appeared on evening news screens, overlaid perfectly with footage of submerged streets. The alignment was undeniable. Homeowners watched with a mix of relief and anger. Relief that responsibility was being acknowledged. Anger that it had taken flooded homes to reach this point. People replayed old meetings in their minds, remembering laughter, interruptions, and comments about overreacting. Legal notices arrived throughout the day. Dexter's assets were frozen pending investigation. Properties flagged. Accounts locked. The financial walls closed in fast once the truth became unavoidable. Confidence evaporates quickly when consequences acquire numbers. By afternoon, class action attorneys filled the community center parking lot. Clipboards replaced cameras. Families lined up to document losses, each story echoing the last. Basements flooded. Electrical systems destroyed. Childhood photos gone. Damage measured in more than dollars. Investigators confirmed that warnings had been received months in advance. Emails showed clear language. Reports outlined specific risks. Recommendations were ignored, then buried. The narrative of ignorance collapsed under timestamps and signatures. As evening approached, state engineers released preliminary mitigation plans. Temporary levees, controlled channels, emergency reinforcement. All expensive, all necessary. All things that could have been implemented proactively at a fraction of the cost. The mood shifted from shock to resolve. Residents began organizing not around fear but around reform. Meetings were scheduled. Bylaws reviewed. Oversight committees proposed. Trust once assumed would now be verified. I watched the sun dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over damaged homes. Water had receded, but its message lingered. Systems fail when accountability does. Communities suffer when expertise is ignored. A reporter asked me how it felt to be proven right. Morning came with the sound of cleanup. Pumps hummed, shovels scraped, and the quiet disbelief of people, surveying what water had taken in a single afternoon. The flood had receded, but its fingerprints were everywhere. Mud-coated walls like a second skin. Basements smelled of oil rot and ruined insulation. Furniture sat in piles along the curb. Entire lives reduced to what could be salvaged and what couldn't. Damage. Assessors moved methodically, photographing, measuring, documenting loss in neutral tones that couldn't soften reality. Insurance adjusters followed. Clipboards out. Questions rehearsed. Many policies covered water damage. Few covered negligence caused by deliberate infrastructure removal. The distinction mattered now, more than anyone had ever imagined. By midday, temporary shelters filled with families who hadn't slept. Children clutched phones and stuffed animals. Parents stared at screens refreshing bank apps, calculating futures they hadn't planned for. Stress doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles into posture and silence. County officials released a statement, expressing concern and promising cooperation. It rang hollow to residents who remembered dismissed emails and ignored warnings. Trust once fractured doesn't mend quickly. Engineers began inspections immediately. Creek channels were surveyed. Flow rates recalculated. Temporary barriers installed where possible. Every mitigation effort now cost exponentially more than prevention ever would have. A volunteer network formed organically. Neighbors helping neighbors. Meals delivered. Generators shared. People who barely spoke before now worked side by side, united by exhaustion and necessity. Crisis has a way of revealing community buried under complacency. At an emergency council meeting that afternoon, the tone was different. No applause. No dismissive smiles. Every presentation was listened to. Every question taken seriously. Authority no longer assumed competence. It demanded proof. Legal briefings followed. Residents learned the difference between policy decisions and personal liability, between official acts and criminal negligence. Names were no longer abstract. They carried weight. Evidence continued surfacing. Deleted files recovered. Financial transfers traced. Testimonies corroborated. Each revelation tightened the narrative into something undeniable. This wasn't misjudgment. It was willful disregard. By evening, national outlets picked up the story. Analysts debated accountability. Experts explained floodplain science. Engineers finally had airtime. Their warnings translated into plain language for millions watching at home. I stood near the creek as twilight settled in. Water moved calmly now as if nothing had happened. That's the illusion nature offers. Calm doesn't mean forgiveness. It means patience. By the next morning, consequences had schedules. Courtrooms opened early. Reporters arrived earlier. Accountability, long delayed, finally had momentum and nowhere left to hide. The courthouse steps filled with cameras, cables, and microphones. Residents gathered quietly, no longer curious spectators but invested witnesses. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was process, procedure, the slow machinery of justice starting to turn. Inside, motions were filed. Emergency hearings convened. Judges reviewed timelines that showed warnings ignored, reports falsified, and authority abused. Each document aligned with another. Patterns formed. Excuses collapsed. Federal investigators coordinated with state prosecutors. Jurisdictions overlapped like gears locking together. Financial records, emails, text messages, all synchronized into a narrative that didn't rely on emotion. It relied on evidence. Outside, experts spoke to the press. Engineers explained floodplains in plain language. Hydrologists described runoff like clockwork, not speculation. Risk became measurable. Preventable became undeniable. Residents listened differently now. Not with outrage, but focus. Understanding replaced argument. Reality doesn't need volume when facts speak clearly. By afternoon, indictments were unsealed. Names read aloud carried weight across the plaza. Charges followed each one with surgical clarity. Fraud, negligence, abuse of office. Violations that stripped away titles and replaced them with accountability. A murmur spread through the crowd, not celebration but release. Validation feels quiet when it arrives after loss. No one cheered. They nodded. Legal analysts broke down what this meant. Insurance exclusions, personal liability, restitution pathways. The flood damage wasn't abstract anymore. It had responsible parties. Community leaders met with emergency planners. Long-term rebuilding began with transparency clauses and independent oversight. Decisions now required documentation. Expertise earned seats at tables previously reserved for influence. Local officials released revised statements carefully worded, heavily advised. Apologies surfaced. Explanations followed. Few convinced anyone. Trust requires consistency, not press releases. That evening, a public forum was held in full daylight. Questions were direct. Answers were demanded. Engineers, lawyers, and planners stood together, presenting unified plans grounded in data. Reconstruction would take time. Infrastructure always does when done right. Temporary measures came first. Permanent solutions followed. No shortcuts this time. I watched families leave the forum with binders instead of flyers. Timelines instead of promises. Clarity instead of slogans. A resident asked whether this would happen again. I said only if people stop paying attention. Systems fail when vigilance fades. Power misbehaves when expertise is ignored. Nature corrects arrogance without apology. Rebuilding doesn't begin with concrete. It begins with humility. Millbrook learned that lesson the hard way. And now every step forward carried the weight of what had already been lost. Survey crews returned to the creek with laser levels and drones. Engineers mapped flow paths that had been ignored for decades. Historical data was layered over modern measurements, revealing patterns no committee vote could ever erase. Water remembered where it belonged, and now the plans respected that truth. Construction zones appeared where lawns once sat. Stone, steel, and reinforced spillways replaced decorative landscaping. It wasn't pretty in the way brochures promise, but it was honest. Infrastructure built for reality rarely flatters aesthetics. Public meetings continued, this time standing room only. Diagrams replaced opinions. Questions were answered with numbers, not reassurance. For the first time, expertise wasn't treated as an obstacle, but as insurance. Federal oversight changed everything. Independent inspectors signed off on each phase. No shortcuts, no rushed approvals. Every decision left a paper trail that could survive sunlight and scrutiny. Transparency became policy, not marketing. Families adjusted. Temporary housing turned into renovation plans. Contractors worked late into the evenings. The rhythm of rebuilding settled into the neighborhood like a second heartbeat. Slow, steady, intentional. Children watched from sidewalks as machines reshaped the land. Some asked why it took a flood for adults to listen. No one had a satisfying answer. Financial recovery followed a brutal order. First safety, then stability, finally restoration. Restitution funds moved through escrow accounts monitored by courts, not boards. Every dollar accounted for, every claim verified. Engineers held workshops explaining floodplain logic in plain language. Diagrams of slopes and runoff replaced vague warnings. Knowledge spread faster when people understood consequences visually. Fear turned into comprehension. I walked the construction line one afternoon, boots muddy, plans tucked under my arm. The creek flowed calmly through temporary channels, contained but restless. Controlled, not conquered. A resident stopped me and said they used to think infrastructure was invisible, something that just existed. Now they saw it as a promise that had to be kept. The new designs extended protection beyond Millbrook. Downstream communities were included for the first time. Shared responsibility replaced isolated thinking. Water didn't stop at property lines, and neither did accountability. Local universities partnered with the project. Students gathered data. Professors published findings. What began as a disaster evolved into a case study in prevention. Lessons documented, not forgotten. By the end of the month, foundations were poured. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small moments, layered over time, until the community realized it was no longer holding its breath. Spring turned into summer, and construction gave way to restoration. Grass replaced mud, sidewalks reopened. The creek once feared became familiar again, flowing within boundaries designed with respect instead of denial. Millbrook gathered often now, not in crisis but in tension. Workshops replaced arguments. Education replaced assumption. People who once avoided meetings showed up early, notebooks in hand, asking better questions. The rebuilt system wasn't hidden. It was visible on purpose. Spillways markers and monitoring stations stood in plain sight. Transparency had become part of the landscape. Infrastructure was no longer something to forget. It was something to understand. Schools integrated flood science into their curriculum. Children learned why the creek curved the way it did, why elevation mattered, why ignoring data had consequences adults were still paying for. The next generation was being taught differently. Local businesses adapted too. Builders followed new codes without complaint. Insurance providers revised risk models using updated data. What once seemed inconvenient was now standard. Reality had reset expectations. A public dedication ceremony marked the completion of the project. No ribbon-cutting theatrics. Just engineers, residents, and officials acknowledging shared responsibility. The message was simple. Protection works when everyone respects it. I watched families walk the path beside the water, pointing out features they recognized. Ownership had shifted. This wasn't someone else's problem anymore. Media coverage faded as drama gave way to stability. Headlines moved on. That was fine. Communities aren't built for attention. They're built for longevity. Audits continued quietly. Oversight committees rotated membership. Power was distributed instead of concentrated. Systems were designed assuming failure was possible, and safeguards existed for when it happened. A resident told me they used to think leadership meant confidence. Now they thought it meant restraint. Knowing when not to override expertise, knowing when to listen. The flood became a reference point. Not a scar, but a lesson. Something people spoke about honestly, without defensiveness. Accountability had made that possible. Tour groups visited occasionally. Planners, engineers, students. They asked how a small community managed to turn a disaster into reform. The answer was never flattering. It was persistence, documentation, refusing to look away. Nature remained indifferent, as always. Rain fell, snow melted, water flowed. But now it did so through systems designed to cooperate instead of resist. Millbrook wasn't perfect. No place is. But it was aware. And awareness is the beginning of resilience. Time has a way of clarifying what noise tries to distort. Months passed and the urgency faded into routine. The sirens were gone. The cameras packed up. What remained was a system doing exactly what it was. Designed to do, quietly protecting. People who no longer questioned its presence. I walked the creek often in the evenings. Not out of vigilance anymore, but reflection. Water slid over stone with a steady patience that felt almost instructive. It reminded me that engineering, like trust, works best when it isn't being tested every day. People stopped apologizing and started acting. That mattered more. The community learned to ask different questions. Not who's in charge, but what does the data say? Not how fast can we build, but what happens 50 years from now? Those questions changed everything. Mistakes were no longer hidden. They were logged, discussed, corrected. Accountability lost its sting once it became normal. Transparency stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like protection. I thought often about my great-grandfather, not as a hero but as a practitioner, someone who understood limits, someone who respected forces bigger than ego or profit. He hadn't built the dam to prove anything. He built it because the land required it. That distinction mattered. Power had failed this community before because it tried to overwrite reality. Authority assumed it could command outcomes without understanding systems. The flood corrected that assumption with brutal clarity. No one argued with gravity anymore. The rebuilt infrastructure didn't just manage water, it managed expectations. It reminded people that some decisions aren't negotiable. They're dictated by physics, history, and consequence. Children played near the water now without fear, but not without awareness. Parents talked openly about what happened. Not to scare them, but to ground them. Memory became a form of prevention. I was asked more than once if I felt vindicated. That wasn't the right word. Vindication implies victory over people. This wasn't that. This was alignment. Between knowledge and action. Between responsibility and outcome. If anything, the experience stripped away illusions. About control. About shortcuts. About the idea that problems disappear if you label them inconvenient. They don't. They wait. The flood wasn't a villain. It was a message delivered in the only language nature uses. Ignore me and I will introduce myself. Millbrook listened, eventually. As I stood on the bridge watching the current carry leaves downstream, I understood something clearly. The real danger was never the water. It was forgetting why the systems existed in the first place. And as long as this community remembered that, it would be ready for whatever came next. Stories like this don't end with applause or headlines. They end quietly, in choices people make after the crisis passes and attention moves on. What happened in Millbrook wasn't just about one corrupt leader or one destroyed structure. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop outsourcing responsibility and start paying attention to how their world actually works. The dam became a symbol, but the lesson was larger. Systems matter. Records matter. Science matters. And when those things are ignored, consequences don't ask permission before arriving. They simply show up on time every time. If there's a reason this story deserves to be told, it isn't revenge. It's memory. Because corruption thrives in silence, and disasters repeat where lessons are forgotten. The moment people stop asking hard questions is the moment someone else starts abusing easy power. This community learned that authority should always be audited. Promises should always be documented. And anyone demanding urgency without transparency deserves skepticism. Emergencies are often manufactured by people who benefit from panic. Millbrook survived because one system was built correctly long before anyone realized how much they depended on it. That's how real protection works. You don't notice it until it's gone. Somewhere out there, another neighborhood is arguing over budgets, aesthetics, or convenience, unaware that their safety depends on something boring, old, and unglamorous. Maybe it's a drainage system. Maybe it's a bridge. Maybe it's a rule everyone complains about until the day it saves them. Pay attention to those things, because the future doesn't reward confidence. It rewards preparation. If this story struck a nerve, it's because most people have seen power misused on a smaller scale. An HOA, a council, a manager who forgets who they serve. The difference between inconvenience and catastrophe is often just one unchecked decision. Share stories like this. Talk about them. Ask uncomfortable questions before water, fire, or collapse forces the conversation for you. And remember this, physics, math, and reality don't negotiate. They don't care who's in charge. They only respond to what's built, what's maintained, and what's ignored. That truth is older than any HOA, stronger than any title, and patient enough to wait until someone forgets it again. That waiting is never cruel, only precise. It allows time for warnings, charts, meetings, and choices. When those chances are ignored, consequences arrive without emotion. They are not punishment. They are results. Understanding that difference is how communities grow wiser instead of louder. Carry this forward. Question shortcuts. Protect boring infrastructure. Support people who bring evidence, not slogans. And remember that real safety is built long before emergencies demand it. That mindset turns stories into safeguards, and disasters into lessons that do not need repeating for the next generation.